The combined Allied armies began to make their way into Germany as the winter of 1944-1945 gradually gave way to spring. These last months of devastating defeat, capitulation, and destruction for the Nazi Reich were the result of years of conflict in Europe, North Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Mediterranean. While Hitler stood in his bunker, directing soldiers that did not exist, Soviet armies advanced on Berlin itself in the east. The Allies were entering the German heartland in the west after crossing the Rhine. While many residents decorated their towns with white flags, bedsheets, tablecloths, and anything else that would protect them from the devastation that the oncoming Allied troops could inflict, large numbers of German troops, who had formerly ruled Europe, suddenly submitted to the inevitable and surrendered in large numbers. This advance frequently happened so quickly that entire towns and villages were taken by advance forces and reconnaissance units with scarcely a shot fired. It was sometimes like the passage of lightning throughout France in the days following the Normandy breakout. But this wasn't always the case. The Nazis could still mount a fierce, tenacious, and resolute defense, costing the Allied forces every foot of the fatherland they took. One such location was Aschaffenburg, a 38,000-person city located 40 miles from Frankfurt on the east bank of a major bend in the Main River. Here, a German major called Lamberth would transform the city into a stronghold of resistance by assembling a haphazard group of SS soldiers, replacements, recovering soldiers, officer hopefuls, and citizens. Surprisingly, they resisted American attempts to seize it for more than a week. Thousands of people would be killed and injured as the combined forces of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division battered the city until it was nearly completely destroyed. Aschaffenburg's history begins in the Roman era. In addition to having a thriving industrial sector, the city was a significant water and rail transportation hub by the Third Reich. There was also a significant military presence because the 106th Infantry Regiment was stationed at Aschaffenburg. There were additional artillery and engineer battalions stationed there, as well as a training school for reserve officers. At last, many injured soldiers were recuperating in nearby hospitals from diseases or combat injuries and were waiting to rejoin their battalions. The defending had an advantage due to the topography in and around the town. Smaller towns and villages can be found scattered throughout the forested slopes of the Spessart Mountains to the north, south, and east. Despite its small size, the Main River would be a terrifying barrier to cross if the attackers were being fired upon. 2 roads and rail lines converged into the city itself. The city was dominated by 2 massive structures, the Stiftskirche, a church from the 10th century that stood on the highest point in the city, and the Schloss Johannisberg, a sturdy palace from the 17th century that was located near the riverfront and almost in the middle of the city. The majority of the military barracks were located in Aschaffenburg's southeast, with training grounds located further south. These barracks were robustly built, and several of them would turn into strong points during the conflict, as was a neighboring military storehouse. Aschaffenburg sat in a depression with other small towns and villages nearby, with the river on one side and primarily high ground surrounding. The diverse range of German soldiers available for the defense reflected the Third Reich's manpower availability at this late stage of the war. The 106th Infantry Regiment has a small replacement and training unit at Aschaffenburg because the regiment was based there. In addition, there were a number of officer candidates training nearby. Many of the German applicants had only 3 years of military experience, in contrast to the U.S. system, which admitted soldiers with a specific educational level to officer training regardless of experience. Even though they might not have been fully recovered for combat, the men in the convalescent hospitals had combat experience. To assist the defenders, the 15th Artillery Regiment and 9th Engineer Battalion were there, along with a few firearms. These were the superior forces on hand, coupled with a minor SS presence. Only a few pieces of artillery, mortars, and Nebelwerfer rocket launchers were available, and there were no tanks. 7 companies of Volkssturm, effectively militia troops with little equipment and training, reinforced these men. They would still fight, though. Finally, the civilian population also contributed to the conflict. The city authorities ordered women, children, and the elderly to leave the city shortly after they made contact with the approaching Americans, claiming that those who stayed would be required to join the battle or pick up guns. Those who remained were forced to take part in some capacity. Many more acted as runners, carried supplies, and cared for injuries during the impending battle, but very few actually engaged in combat. In the future, the Americans would report battling with a large number of civilians. Kampfkommando Aschaffenburg, a combat group designation that brought all of the city's units under one direction, was formed by about 5,000 soldiers. Hitler himself gave the city this designation, making it a stronghold that needed to be defended with the utmost effort. The garrison's overall strength would reach about 8,500 thanks to reinforcements obtained throughout the conflict. A World War I veteran named Major Emil Lamberth was chosen to command this combat force. In June 1944, he had come to the city to assume command of the 9th Engineers. He was named Senior Garrison Commander on January 30th, 1945. He had helped plan the city's defenses and connected them to the main river's broader defense line. He was put under Hitler's direct authority on March 5th after being named combat group leader and taking an oath to protect the city. To monitor the combat group's attentiveness, a tiny SS delegation traveled to Aschaffenburg. Lamberth's defense plan worked, even in the face of Nazi Party meddling. The overall strategy was intended to serve as a link in the Main's defensive chain. Using the Main itself as a natural barrier, several positions were established along the east bank of the river. This defensive belt had been lined with bunkers, some of which would be used by the garrison at Aschaffenburg. In order to form a defense in depth and to create a perimeter around the city, more strong points were established. Schweinheim and Meineshof, two of the outlying settlements, would be well fortified. The core area surrounding the Schloss Johannesburg and the riverfront were fortified in Aschaffenburg proper. The majority of the town was actually made up of brick or stone structures that were crammed together with the comparatively small streets typical of earlier European cities. These structures alone offered decent cover that was impervious to small arms fire and, to a lesser degree, tank and artillery fire. Naturally, the Main's bridges would blow. Only 1/3 of the 36th Volksgrenadier Division's 6,500-strong strength was trained, making it the primary German unit outside the city. It possessed 2 assault cannons and 3 artillery battalions at half strength. When the Americans arrived, time ran out. But the Aschaffenburg command would have been more closely linked to the region's entire defense. The Americans were only 9 miles west of the city in Babenhausen. Lamberth was informed at 9 a.m. on Palm Sunday, March 25th. By midday, the lead U.S. forces were spotted by sentries stationed in the Schloss Johannesburg's towers. As the bridges remained intact, General George S. Patton's Third Army was being led across the main river by Combat Command B, CCB of the 4th Armored Division. Under the command of the now famous Colonel Crichton Abrams, CCB immediately headed toward the main road bridge across the river, straight along the road from Babenhausen to Aschaffenburg. Named for the settlement at its southern end, the Nilkheim salient was a section on the west bank from which this bridge crossed the Main straight into the city. As soon as CCB arrived at the bridge, he attempted to cross. The Americans continued to fight despite heavy German small arms fire. The lead American tank began to cross after nosing onto the span. It took a lot of hits right away. Mortar fire, handheld Panzerfausts, and anti-tank bullets all hammered the poor Sherman before it exploded. The span and the Sherman were thrown into the river below when the bridge was destroyed by the Germans a few seconds later. In the direction of Nilkheim, CCB withdrew from the bridge. At the same time, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Cohen, the commander of the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion, learned from his reconnaissance platoon that a railroad bridge south of Nilkheim was also still intact. The Germans had not defended it as strongly as they did the road bridge, but it was ready to be demolished. In order to provide fire support, Cohen gave his scouts orders to capture the bridge and seize any armored vehicles in the area. Even though they were under heavy fire, the scouts hurried across and immediately began to disable the aerial bombs that were mounted on the bridge. They pushed the explosives into the river and cut any lines they came across. After that, Cohen formed a bridgehead by sending 3 of his infantry companies across. A few tanks from Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion and the infantry's half-tracks soon followed. In about 30 minutes after the German sentries spotted them, CCB had across the river and was battling its way up the Erbig and Bischberg, 2 hills south of Schweinheim. The Germans had not had time to demolish the bridge as intended because everything had happened so quickly. Later, the German commander in charge of the bridge asserted that the explosives on the span lacked detonators. In the middle of the day, CCB attempted to surge into Schweinheim in an attempt to maintain its momentum. It was defended by a number of well-dug-in regiments with an engineer platoon attached, made up of replacement troops and officer hopefuls. In the face of fierce opposition, American infantry and tanks advanced across wide fields into the town. In several areas, the fighting turned hand to hand. Before the Americans withdrew to the hills, several tanks were lost. While some U.S. troops mopped up isolated German pockets in the area, others had proceeded north down the river to the suburbs of Aschaffenburg. The Americans had captured a valuable bridgehead by the conclusion of the first day of the combat, but they were unable to send enough troops across in time to take advantage of it before the Germans started to reinforce. A boundary shift was scheduled for midnight, with the lines defining the local American units' responsibilities shifting. Aschaffenburg would then be in the area of the 45th Infantry Division, a division of the U.S. 15th Corps, when that boundary line moved to the north, the 7th Army. Insufficient infantry for an urban campaign meant that 4th Armored was ready to surrender. Lambert fortified the positions east of the American bridgehead, and in Schweinheim as German troops kept coming in. A bizarre incident that is commonly referred to as the Hammelburg Raid then started. It undoubtedly had an impact on the fight of Aschaffenburg, even though it was distinct from it. In order to reach the town of Hammelburg, which was home to a prison camp housing Allied commanders, including Patton's son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, who had been captured in Tunisia almost 2 years prior, General Patton sent a task force of tanks, armored infantry, and artillery past Aschaffenburg. Preparing a force of 294 soldiers under the direction of Captain Abraham Baum to breach German defenses, move toward Hammelburg, free the camp, and return the prisoners of war took up a large portion of March 26th. The attack, which had to pass through the southern part of well-fortified Schweinheim to reach the road to Hammelburg, was preceded by a 30-minute artillery barrage. Even though it took them till midnight to pass through the town, Baum and his men persisted. After breaching the main defensive line, they moved quickly in the direction of the POW camp, shooting up many trains that were transporting supplies and reinforcements. After Baum's army arrived at the camp, where there were too many prisoners of war to evacuate, it attempted to fight its way back with some of them, but was basically pursued, and all of its soldiers were either killed or taken prisoner. German commanders, fearing a U.S. breakthrough, were confused by the first reports of an American force penetrating so deeply. They dispatched more reinforcements to the area. Over the course of the following several days, a lot of work was put into capturing and containing Baum's troops, which took some focus away from Aschaffenburg. To bolster the defenders, however, a number of training units of company and battalion size started to arrive in the Aschaffenburg area. CCB retreated to the high terrain south of the city. Having now detached some of its strength for the raid, they even abandoned the hard-won stronghold in Schweinheim. The following morning, March 27th, CCB began to retire across the Main. The 26th Division's 1st Battalion, 104th Infantry Regiment, which had been attached to the 4th Armored, took its place in the bridgehead. The 45th Infantry Division was directed to Aschaffenburg since the region was now under the control of the 15th Corps. The 45th was a veteran force that had been in battle since the 1943 invasion of Sicily and was commanded by Major General Robert Frederick, the former chief of the 1st Special Service Force. Colonel Walter P. O'Brien led the 157th Regiment, which Frederick ordered to capture the city. Lieutenant-Colonel Felix Sparks commanded the regiment's 3rd Battalion, which was directed to take the lead and occupy the hills and the bridgehead. The regiment as a whole, including the troops of the 3rd Battalion, were informed that the town had been cleared by the 3rd Army, but this was obviously untrue. Sparks was not told anything about Captain Baum's task force or its purpose, but he did receive a vague warning not to fire on any American tanks he saw in front of him. It would be years before Sparks even learned about the raid. By 2 p.m. on March 27th, the battalion arrived at the railroad bridge and started to cross. They were instantly under mortar and rifle fire. Sparks discovered that the bridge was guarded by a company of reconnaissance soldiers in armored trucks and jeeps. Sparks was informed by the lieutenant in charge of the recon forces that he had been instructed to hold the bridge until he was relieved. After taking his place, Sparks moved his battalion to defensive positions on the other side of the river. Schweinheim's 2 attacks were repulsed. Sparks peered through his binoculars at Schweinheim and Aschaffenburg from the high ground. There was no bustle in the streets, no white flags or bed sheets hanging from the windows. A civilian informed me that there were several thousand Germans in the town, Lieutenant Colonel Sparks recalled. Nobody seemed to trust me when I radioed that information back to the division. The 157th would have to battle for the region because it was not secured. 2 infantry companies were dispatched into Schweinheim with the assistance of an artillery battery from the 158th Field Artillery Battalion and an associated tank destroyer company. A few captives were taken in this attack, and the foothold that the 4th Armored CCB had abandoned was reclaimed. Attempts to unite disparate divisions into a unified army persisted on the German side. Using the available men and artillery, the commander of the German 36th Volksgrenadier Division started organizing a counterattack to drive the Americans back over the Main. The remainder of the 157th Regiment arrived and started to cross the river on the morning of the 4th day of the conflict. Me-109 sorties against the bridge area were the only enemy activity. Using the regiment's 3 battalions and its auxiliary units, namely the 158th Field Artillery Battalion with 105mm howitzers, Company A of the 191st Tank Battalion, Company B of the 645th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and Company C of the 2nd Chemical Mortar Battalion, a strategy was developed to capture Aschaffenburg. In preparation for an assault on Schweinheim, Sparks' 357th started to gather east of Erbig Hill. Major Gus Heilmann's 257th would launch an offensive northward along the river toward the city of Aschaffenburg. Company G of the battalion would follow in reserve, while Company F moved north down the riverside, with Company E protecting its right flank. Company D of the 191st Tank Battalion, which was armed with the M5 Stuart light tank, would provide some extra support to this outfit. In order to effectively sit in reserve until Schweinheim was secured and then capture the area northwest of it, Lieutenant Ralph Krieger's 157th would form up between the 2 other battalions. An artillery preparation preceded the attack. I Company was on the left, K Company was on the right, and L Company was in reserve as Sparks' forces advanced into the eastern part of Schweinheim. The Germans immediately and fiercely resisted. Only the outskirts of Schweinheim were in American control when the onslaught was stopped at dusk, despite the Americans' massive artillery bombardment and air support directed at the town. The 157th also encountered strong German opposition right away as they moved north toward Aschaffenburg. Before it too halted for the night, Company F advanced around 2 kilometers in spite of withering machine gun and Panzerfaust fire. In order to bridge the vulnerable gap between the 2nd and 3rd battalions, Company C of the 157th moved into that space. Overall, not much had been accomplished during the day's offensive, which the German defenders had fiercely opposed. The Americans were hit by German mortar fire and responded with counter-battery fire all night long on March 28th. Soldiers from the 157th discovered a warehouse stocked with alcohol during the day. Vintages that had been seized from all over Europe had apparently been sent to Aschaffenburg for storage. A recipe for a drink that the soldiers made with their war booty is included in the unit's unofficial history. This loot was swiftly dispersed across the regiment. The 157th Zombie was made up of 1-4 Cognac, 1-4 Benedictine, 1-4 Cointreau, and 1-4 of any other bottle handy, followed by a champagne chaser. The tale continued. Ixcad. Many days passed before some canteens carried anything so tasteless as water. The 179th and 180th Regiments of the 45th crossed the Main and moved south to join the 3rd Infantry Division after combat engineers installed planking to strengthen the railroad bridge. The 180th proceeded south to establish contact with the 3rd Division, while the 179th joined the 157th's flank. The the fight for Aschaffenburg centered on the southern part of the city, including Schweinheim, when the fifth day of the conflict began. The 157th Regiment's push was the main focus of the battle. For as long as possible, the Americans had to avoid gaining control of the high terrain between Schweinheim and Aschaffenburg. Parts of these locations had already been reduced to rubble by the artillery bombardment and air. Throughout Schweinheim, the German officer hopefuls took up positions in several strong spots. The Germans would reoccupy areas that the Americans had already cleared by use of a network of subterranean tunnels that connected several of these fortified homes. GIs attempting to clear the next house would be fired on from the last one captured, which would be a terrible surprise. Snipers continuously infiltrated the American rear regions, using their knowledge of the town. Although the U.S. advance was somewhat impeded by these astute strategies, they also played a part in the eventual catastrophic devastation of Aschaffenburg. The U.S. 45th Division's seasoned soldiers, who had not anticipated fighting here in the first place and were well aware of the dangers of fighting in an urban area, wasted no time in using all of their available weaponry to force the Germans from their positions. After nearly 2 years of combat, the infantrymen of the 157th were able to cooperate with tanks, artillery, and air support. Now, all of that expertise would be put to use at Aschaffenburg. Both invading American battalions renewed their attacks around 7:30 a.m. on March 29th. The two 157th had to summon Sherman tanks to fire directly into the fortified residences after encountering strong and immediate opposition once more. With 2 companies moving in tandem and the 3rd in reserve, Sparks launched an attack at Schweinheim. Bitter house-to-house fighting slowed the approach to a crawl, and it took Company C, on the left flank, an hour to reach the town's first street. While artillery and mortar fire weakened the German fortifications, resolute resistance forced the Americans to retreat and dig in. O'Brien sent his reserve battalion against the middle of the German line in an attempt to breach the enemy line. The onslaught gained little ground there, and the resistance was as firm as the rest of the line. Sparks's battalion persisted in moving forward in Schweinheim, block after block. All available firepower was focused on the town to aid in this endeavor. Enemy strongholds were directly hit by tank and tank destroyer fire. One building at a time had to be cleared. The infantry was able to overrun a targeted structure, while the Germans inside were pinned because the tanks and tank destroyers focused their fire on it. Violent fighting was the norm inside the German town. Company A, 191st Tank Battalion, lost 2 Shermans to anti-tank fire at close range. There were still about 3,000 civilians in the town, many of whom were injured and difficult for the German medical staff to treat. When one of the convalescent troops was accused of desertion, Major Lamberth ordered his hanging. Lieutenant Heyman, the officer, was instructed on March 26 to register with the local leadership in order to be assigned to the defense. He was taken into custody later that day for failing to register and for allegedly creating an English sign that was discovered concealed in a cellar. After being found guilty and court-martialed, he was carried out into the street in front of a cafe and hanged from a lamppost on the 29th. He was branded a coward and his body was left hanging with a placard on it. On March 29th, shortly after midnight, the 36th Volksgrenadier launched their counterattack. The 165th Grenadier Regiment breached the American cordon on the east and south sides of the bridgehead, aiming for the high territory surrounding Erbig Hill. While the 87th Grenadier Regiment had infiltrated the southern end of the perimeter, they arrived at the region between the Erbig and Bischberg Hills 4 hours later. By noon, vigorous counterattacks by the 157th Regiment, again with coordinated tank and artillery support, and a battalion of the 179th Regiment had forced the Germans back to their starting positions. The divisions surrounding Aschaffenburg were gradually being driven back, further isolating the city, and making the German position untenable. By the afternoon, Aschaffenburg was cut off when the German LX Corps gave in and ordered its soldiers to leave. General Frederick directed his 179th and 180th Regiments to advance eastward and take up positions to flank Aschaffenburg in order to finalize this isolation. The 157th kept gaining progress into Schweinheim and the city's southern suburbs as they did so. 5 counterattacks, each the size of a company, were launched by the defenders. Even though the Americans suffered several losses, they defeated every one of them and dealt the Germans severe, irreparable losses. Small groups of resistance remained in the northeast and northwest corners of Schweinheim after the 157th was able to split the town in two. Two companies, A and B, circled Schweinheim to attack the high hills to the southeast in an effort to flank the German position. They made a 1,000-yard advance despite the fire. Now the American leaders realized that encircling their enemy was a preferable course of action than launching a direct attack. Since all of the German counterattacks had failed, their only option was to grimly hang out and cause the Germans as much damage as possible. Once more, the 45th Division made the most of its support assets' firepower. The 191st Tank Battalion's additional armor was used. The Americans also imported more artillery. The 45th was joined by the 4 artillery battalions of the nearby 44th Division. The 45th was also assigned 5 corps-level battalions, some equipped with large 8-inch howitzers. The city was now bombarded by so much artillery that some Germans compared it to machine gun fire. Overhead, 64th Fighter Wing P-47 Thunderbolts started firing rockets, napalm, and Orange 50 caliber rounds at Aschaffenburg. A pair of Messerschmitt Me-262 jets failed to bring down the bridge, and the defenders, now alone, lacked the soldiers and weaponry to either reclaim or destroy it. 4 German Navy frogmen attempted to put an explosive charge on the bridge by floating down the Main from Aschaffenburg after dark on March 30th. All 4 of the frogmen were killed when mortar fire was directed at them. The city's envelopment persisted on the final day of March. The 157th attacked north along the eastern edge of the city, while the 157th kept pushing into the southern part of Aschaffenburg, and the 357th mopped up in Schweinheim. To aid finish the envelopment, the 179th Regiment, which was on the 157th's right flank, also moved north. The P-47s resurfaced in the air and proceeded to wreak havoc on the garrison. Massed artillery, frequently firing time-on-target missions, smashed the remaining buildings into rubble if the planes weren't overhead. The Schloss Johannesburg, the enemy headquarters, was frequently struck. While self-propelled weapons were moved forward to directly help the GIs, fires were occasionally ignited by white phosphorus rounds fired by the 4.2-inch mortar. In addition to continuing their sniping and infiltration back into lost territory, the Germans retaliated with heavy mortar fire. One barrage dropped 200 rounds in 15 minutes. The Americans' advance was stopped near Schweinheim when 2 tanks, one recognized as a German Mark VI Tiger, and the other a captured Sherman that had been quickly painted with German crosses and the word Bütepanzer, caught tank, opened fire on them. The Sherman was destroyed by a 645th M36 tank destroyer with its 90mm gun. A German crewman's scorched and burned body hung out of one of the hull hatches. The Mark VI was also promptly destroyed. Captain Ants Spares, the adjutant for the 157th, flew over Schloss Johannesburg around midday and left a note. This ultimatum threatened to level the town if the Germans persisted in the battle, demanded the garrison's surrender, and ensured adherence to the Geneva Conventions. The fate of Aschaffenburg is in your hands. More surrender flyers were distributed across the city. The barracks north of Schweinheim caught American notice in the afternoon. Company K of the 157th had gained a tiny footing in the artillery caserna, which is closest to Schweinheim, by nightfall. Other than that, they allowed fire support to start the process of reducing the enemy's stronghold. In Aschaffenburg, Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945, was not a day of peace. In order to complete their envelopment, the 157th and 379th captured the nearby towns of Hosbach, Halbach, Goldbach, and Geilbach. The final 2 towns resisted until the following afternoon, but the first 2 surrendered swiftly. The encirclement was finished with this move. The barracks area had to be seized in order to exploit this flank. After 6 hours of preparing their weaponry, Sparks's Company K, 157th, launched another attack at 1 p.m. The onslaught was repulsed by small arms fire from about 100 convalescents. Tanks now advanced and bombarded opposing positions with white phosphorus shells. After storming the building, the GIs engaged in fierce room-to-room fighting to capture it. The Bois Brûlés Caserne across the street, the next German outpost, was captured in the same manner. Both were in American hands in 4 hours. Every defender of the second building was wounded because of how fierce the combat was. The Pioneer Caserne, a considerably larger barracks northwest of the first two, was the last to be captured. The 157th, who had prepared ahead of time and saw the battle for the first two strongpoints, won this mission. Two M12 self-propelled 155mm howitzers were moved up to a hill overlooking the objective in addition to the standard artillery bombardment. As the American troops fought to capture the Caserne, they fired over 100 bullets straight into it. Half of it had fallen by the end of the day. The Germans were now suffering from the constant bombardment of the artillery, air support, mortars, and armor. Even though many of their locations were so well defended that they were largely immune to the fire's physical impacts, it was now having an adverse psychological effect on them, preventing them from getting enough sleep and making it dangerous to move supplies. April 2nd was the final full day of combat. Although resistance persisted, it was disorganized. The sister regiments of the 157th completed capturing the neighboring towns and set up more barricades. Following mopping up operations, the 157th moved north and joined the 44th Division's 324th Infantry Regiment, which had taken up positions north of Aschaffenburg. By mid-afternoon, only a handful of the German defenders of the Pioneer Caserne remained, after the majority withdrew late in the morning. By nightfall, 157th had infiltrated the eastern suburbs and taken up residence in a forested park that stretched into the center of Aschaffenburg, while 257th had battled its way into the city's core. As more and more Germans gave up, the air and artillery attacks persisted. On April 2nd, more than 1,100 were taken into custody. The Schloss was surrounded by the remaining defenders. Luckily, Major Lamberth had made the decision to call off the now futile conflict. He sent a Volkssturm officer to negotiate conditions with a captive American around 7 a.m. Colonel O'Brien refused to engage in negotiations and threatened to keep the fighting going until Lamberth surrendered by 8 a.m. Unaware of the potential capitulation, GIs on the American side prepared tanks, planes, and artillery. To ensure that the surrender party understood the message, O'Brien dispatched 2 lieutenants who spoke German. Although Lamberth consented to surrender, he refused to turn himself in to a lower-ranking officer. O'Brien dispatched Lieutenant Kohler Sparks to the Schloss because he was the closest-ranking officer. "So I got word and I was a few blocks away," Sparks remembered. "This major gave an order, and all of his officers emerged from the building in single file when I drove up there in my Jeep, got out, and went up to the building. I said, 'I'm a colonel, and now I want you to surrender.' They dropped their pistol belts at my feet after removing them. I informed the major that he needed to persuade the Germans to give up as well, because I knew they still had some strong points. 'All right,' he replied, so I got him into a Jeep with me. We drove around and he indicated the locations of the strong spots. I would then force him to approach them and shout in German for them to surrender. Strong points, were 3 or 4 in number. Aschaffenburg came to an end at that point. Sparks remembered seeing the German lieutenant's body still dangling from the lamppost. At 9 in the morning, the capitulation occurred. The exhausted soldiers of the 157th Regiment went to the towns of Goldbach and Hoesbach to regroup after the city was deemed cleared at 1 p.m. 70% of Aschaffenburg was destroyed, the result of a valiant but fruitless battle. 3,500 of the 8,500 defenders were taken prisoner of war, and 1,600 were killed or injured. There were perhaps 20 American deaths and 300 injuries. The city itself now lay broken as an example of the futility of resistance, according to the unofficial history of the 157th. Air, artillery, and infantry had hammered it to rubble, killed its people, and left those who survived punch-drunk from the day and nighttime pounding.